The silver chalice trembled in Thea Brystein's pale fingers as her sisters shoved her forward, their laughter cutting through the smoky air of the great hall like shattered ice. Her simple gray dress hung loose on her slender frame, a shadow against the platinum waterfall of her hair as she stumbled toward the raised platform where the Alpha King waited in firelight and darkness. Her eldest sister Anna had painted her lips crimson and wore a gown of midnight blue, cut low enough to show the strength in her shoulders, the predator in her bones. The middle sister, Rebecca, had woven leather and gold through her dark waves and anointed herself with oils that made the torchlight dance across her skin like promises. They had plotted for moons, these sisters who shared her blood but not her gentleness, scheming how to capture the attention of Eirik Heimdall, the Alpha King whose mere presence made lesser wolves bare their throats in submission. But when the moment arrived to serve him, when the winter feast demanded someone present the king with the ceremonial chalice of mead, they had seized Thea by her delicate wrists and thrust the goblet into her shaking hands. "Go," Anna had hissed, her nails carving crescents into Thea's pale skin. "You're the Omega. You serve. That's the only thing you're good for." Rebecca's laugh had been poison wrapped in silk. "Perhaps if you're fortunate, he'll notice you before his gaze finds someone worthy." So Thea walked, her heart a wild bird throwing itself against the cage of her ribs, her eyes lowered as an Omega must be, her footsteps hushed as falling snow. The great hall stretched before her like a frozen eternity, packed with wolves from every territory in the realm, their eyes tracking her movement, their whispers hissing like wind through dead branches. The torches overhead threw restless shadows across rough stone walls, illuminating tapestries that told of ancient wars, legendary bonds, destinies woven in starlight and blood. The scent of roasted venison and pine smoke hung thick in the air, mingling with the sharp bite of winter cold that crept through the high windows. She could sense him before she saw him clearly. The Alpha King's presence was gravity itself, pulling at something deep inside her chest, something she had never felt before and possessed no name for. The air around the platform seemed to crackle, charged as though lightning slept just beneath the surface of the world, waiting to wake. Thea climbed the 3 stone steps to the throne, her knees weak, her breath coming shallow and quick. She kept her gaze locked on the chalice in her hands, watching how the mead caught the firelight like liquid amber, how her own reflection wavered in its golden surface, ghost-like and insubstantial. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the snap and pop of the great hearth. "Your mead." Silence fell like the first snow of winter over the hall. Even the flames seemed to pause their dance. And then, for the first time in her 19 years, Thea Brystein made the forbidden choice of looking up. Eirik Heimdall was a man forged from thunder and battle. He sat upon his throne of ancient oak and iron, broad-shouldered and powerfully built even in stillness, his presence filling the space around him the way darkness floods a room when the final candle dies. His hair, black as a raven's wing, fell in waves to his shoulders, speaking of wildness barely leashed. His beard was trimmed close but couldn't soften the brutal angles of his jaw, the fierce beauty of his face. His eyes, dark as storm clouds, had been studying the crowd with an expression of profound weariness until they found her. Welcome back to the channel. Or if you're new here, welcome to a story that's going to grip your heart and refuse to let go. Tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing our pack spread across the globe. And hey, how are you doing today? I genuinely want to know. Now, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you don't want to miss what happens next in this story. Ready? Let's begin. The moment their eyes met, something shattered in the air between them. Thea felt it like a physical blow, a golden thread pulled taut, a song she had never heard but had been humming her entire life suddenly given voice. Her breath caught. The chalice nearly slipped from her trembling fingers. The Alpha King's expression transformed. The weariness vanished, replaced by something raw and startled, something that looked almost like recognition, like a warrior finding something he had lost before he ever knew to search for it. He leaned forward slowly, his battle-scarred hands gripping the arms of his throne, his dark eyes widening with an intensity that made Thea's knees buckle. She caught herself, steadied her hands, and extended the chalice toward him with all the grace she could summon. Her sister's laughter had died somewhere behind her. The entire hall held its breath. Ira Heimdall reached out, and when his calloused fingers brushed against hers as he took the goblet, a spark of energy passed between them, bright and sharp as static shock, warm as summer sun on bare skin. Thea gasped softly. The king's eyes flashed gold for just an instant, the wolf rising to the surface, recognizing, claiming, knowing. "Your name," he said, his voice deep and rough as distant thunder. The mead sat forgotten in his hand. "Tell me your name." Thea swallowed hard, her throat dry as autumn leaves. "Thea, your majesty. Thea Brystein." "Thea," he repeated as though tasting each syllable, as though her name were a prayer he had forgotten how to speak. His gaze traveled over her face, her platinum hair catching firelight like moonbeams, her eyes wide and clear as a winter sky. The simple gray dress seemed to glow against her pale skin, shadow and light, earth and ice. From behind her, Anna's voice rang out, honey-sweet and poisonous. "Your Majesty, our youngest sister is clumsy and simple-minded. She begged to be allowed to serve you, though we told her she wasn't worthy. Please forgive her presumption." Rebecca stepped forward, her dark hair gleaming, her smile calculated to devastate. "We, your loyal subjects, would be honored to attend to your needs personally. Our sister is merely an Omega after all. Surely you would prefer company more befitting your station." The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ira Heimdall's eyes never left Thea's face, but the warmth that had been building there turned to ice when he finally, slowly, turned his attention to her sisters. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of power that could shatter mountains and bend rivers to new courses. "I did not ask for your names," he said quietly. "I did not ask for your presence. I asked for hers." Anna's face flushed crimson. Rebecca's smile froze and cracked like ice over deep water. The court erupted in whispers, a storm of shock and speculation that swept through the hall like wind through dead trees. Eirik turned back to Thea, and his expression softened, the brutal edges giving way to something that looked almost like wonder. "Step closer," he said. And it was not a command but a request, gentle as he knew how to make his voice. "Please." Thea's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to make herself small and invisible as she had learned to do. But something stronger, something that lived in her bones and sang in her blood, told her to stay. She took one step forward, then another, until she stood close enough to see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, close enough to smell pine and smoke and something wild clinging to his skin. "You feel it too," he said softly, meant only for her ears. "Don't you?" It was not a question. Thea nodded, unable to speak, unable to deny the truth that thrummed between them like a living thing. She had heard stories all her life about the bond, the sacred connection that tied true mates together, soul to soul, wolf to wolf. She had never expected to find it. Omegas rarely did. They were meant to serve, to support, to fade into the background of greater wolves' lives. But here she stood, trembling before the Alpha King of all the realm, feeling a connection so powerful it threatened to unmake her. "I need you to stay," Eirik said, his hand lifting slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished. When she didn't, his fingers touched her cheek, rough calluses against soft skin, warm and gentle despite the strength coiled in every line of his body. "Will you stay?" Behind her, Anna hissed something vicious. Rebecca's voice rose in protest. The court buzzed with scandal and shock, but Thea heard none of it. The world had narrowed to the man before her, to the warmth of his touch, to the bond that sang between them like starlight made sound. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll stay." Something fierce and triumphant flashed across Eirik Heimdall's face. His hand slid from her cheek to the back of her neck, gentle but possessive, and he stood from his throne, rising to his full height, towering over her but somehow making her feel safe rather than small. "Then you are under my protection," he declared, his voice carrying across the silent hall. Let it be known that Thea Brystein is mine to guard, mine to care for, mine to defend. Anyone who harms her, insults her, or forces her to act against her will answers to me." His eyes, glowing gold now with the power of his wolf, swept over Anna and Rebecca with lethal promise. "Is that understood?" The sisters paled. The court bowed. And Thea, who had spent 19 years being invisible, being small, being forgotten, felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking but blooming, like spring after endless winter, like dawn after the longest night. The feast continued around them, but the hall had transformed into something else entirely. A battlefield of whispers and shock, of tradition cracking under the weight of the impossible. Eirik kept his hand at the small of Thea's back, a point of warmth and connection that anchored her to this new reality, and guided her to a seat beside his throne, a place that had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. He poured her mead with his own battle-scarred hands, served her roasted venison from his own plate, and spoke to her in low tones that made the rest of the hall fade into irrelevance. Around them, the court watched with barely concealed fascination. Some scandalized, others intrigued, all of them struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. Anna and Rebecca had retreated to a far corner of the hall, their faces masks of barely contained fury. Anna's carefully applied paint looked garish now in the firelight, her beauty turned sharp and bitter. Rebecca's hands trembled as she gripped her goblet, her knuckles white with the force of her rage. The sisters who had schemed and plotted, who had pushed Thea forward expecting humiliation, now watched as their Omega sister sat beside the Alpha King like she belonged there. "You're shaking," Eirik observed, his brow furrowing with concern as he studied Thea's face. "Are you cold? Afraid?" "Both," Thea admitted, her hands wrapped around the goblet he'd given her, drawing warmth from the heated mead. "And neither. I don't understand what's happening. You've never learned about the mate bond." It was a statement, not a question, and there was anger beneath it, not directed at her, but at a world that had failed to teach her about her own birthright. "I've heard stories," Thea said softly, her voice barely audible over the crackling hearth. "But I'm an Omega. We don't usually find true mates. We're meant to serve the pack, not to be chosen by one." Eirik's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his beard. "Who told you that?" "Everyone," Thea said simply. "It's just how things are." The Alpha King leaned close, his dark eyes intense, his voice low and fierce. "Then everyone is wrong. The bond doesn't care about designation. It doesn't care about status or rank or what anyone thinks should be. It cares about souls that fit together." His hand covered hers, dwarfing her pale fingers. "And yours, Thea Brystein, fits with mine like two halves of the same whole." Thea felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't say if they were from joy or fear or the overwhelming weight of being truly seen for the first time in her life. Around them, the feast carried on, but they existed in their own world now. A space carved out by destiny and defended by the Alpha King's absolute authority. For the first time in 10 years of ruling through strength and solitude, Eirik Heimdall felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought long dead. Not just desire or duty but hope. The Omega girl beside him, with her platinum hair and frightened eyes, had awakened something he'd forgotten existed. The possibility that he didn't have to face eternity alone. When the feast burned low and the night grew cold, Eirik stood and offered Thea his hand. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "I want to show you something." Thea placed her hand in his, marveling at how natural the gesture felt, as though their hands had been made to fit together. He led her from the great hall, away from the watching eyes and whispered speculation, down corridors lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on ancient stone. Guards bowed as they passed, servants pressed themselves against walls, everyone giving the Alpha King and his unexpected mate space and respect. They climbed a spiral staircase higher and higher until Eirik pushed open a heavy wooden door and cold night air rushed in to greet them. They emerged onto a balcony that jutted out from the castle's highest tower, the world spreading out below them in patterns of moonlight and shadow. Pine forests stretched like dark seas toward mountains that rose against the star-strewn sky, their peaks crowned with eternal snow. "This is my favorite place," Eirik said quietly, standing beside her at the stone railing. Away from the court, away from the weight of 1,000 watching eyes, his warrior's mask began to slip. "When the burden gets too heavy, I come here. The height reminds me that I'm small. The stars remind me that I'm temporary. It helps." Thea looked up at him, seeing how the moonlight caught in his dark hair, how it softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing something vulnerable beneath the battle-hardened exterior. "How long have you carried this burden alone?" 10 years, Eirik said, his voice rough with old pain. "My father died in battle against the Eastern Territories. I was 20, barely trained, barely ready. But the kingdom needed an alpha king, so I became one. I ruled through strength and fear because those were the only tools I knew how to use." He paused, his hands gripping the stone railing. "I've been alone, Thea. Surrounded by thousands but utterly alone. Until tonight." Thea's heart ached for him. She understood loneliness, had lived it every day of her life, invisible among her own family. "I know what it means to be alone," she whispered. "I've spent 19 years being invisible. My sisters always told me I was worthless, that I'd never be more than a servant. I learned to make myself small, to disappear, to survive by not drawing attention." Her voice grew softer. "I believed them. I believed I was nothing." Eirik turned to face her fully, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "You were never nothing," he said fiercely. "The world was just too blind to see you. But I see you, Thea. From that first moment in the hall, I saw everything you are." He reached up slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished. When she didn't, his calloused hands cupped her face with infinite gentleness, as though she were something precious and breakable. "You're beautiful," he murmured. "And brave. And kind. And mine." Then he kissed her, his lips claiming hers with a tenderness that made her knees weak. Thea's eyes fluttered closed as the world tilted and rearranged itself around them. The bond between them flared to life fully, no longer tentative but blazing. A golden thread visible in the darkness, binding them together in ways that transcended flesh and bone. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eirik rested his forehead against hers. "I will never let you feel small again," he promised. "Never invisible. Never alone." Thea woke to sunlight streaming through tall windows and the scent of wildflowers filling the air. She blinked, disoriented, taking in the royal chambers that Eirik had given her. Rooms adjacent to his own, with walls painted in soft creams and golds. Vases of mountain blooms sat on every surface, their petals still wet with morning dew. Soft furs covered the bed and a fire crackled gently in the hearth. He had filled her world with warmth while she slept. But outside their sanctuary, poison was already spreading through the castle like rot through wood. Anna moved through the court with calculated precision, her voice honey-sweet as she whispered to anyone who would listen. "Dark magic," she murmured to a cluster of highborn ladies near the solar. "How else could a simple Omega ensnare an Alpha King? Our poor sister always was drawn to forbidden things." The ladies exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to suspicion. Rebecca took a different approach, cornering influential alphas in the training yards and council chambers. "The bond is false," she insisted, her dark eyes wide with feigned concern. "The king is bewitched by her unusual appearance, that unnatural white hair. He's not thinking clearly. An Omega Queen? It goes against everything we are, everything we've built. She'll weaken him, weaken us all." The sisters gathered allies quickly, highborn wolves who saw Thea's sudden elevation as a threat to the natural order they'd always known. If an Omega could become queen, what other traditions might crumble? What other hierarchies might fall? Thea felt the hostility the moment she stepped into the corridors. Eyes followed her everywhere, cold and assessing. Whispers died when she approached, only to resume louder once she'd passed. Highborn ladies turned their backs when she entered rooms. Alphas looked through her as though she didn't exist, or worse, stared with open contempt. She tried to attend a council meeting and was told her presence wasn't required. She attempted to join the ladies at their needlework and was met with icy silence. Every door seemed closed, every face unwelcoming. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. Lost and overwhelmed, Thea found herself wandering toward the only place that felt safe, down away from the highborn quarters, toward the warm glow of the castle kitchens. The head cook, an older woman named Greta with flour-dusted hands and laugh lines around her eyes, looked up in surprise when Thea entered. "Pie lady? Are you lost?" "No," Thea said softly. May I sit here for a while?" Something in her voice must have reached Greta, because the woman simply nodded and went back to kneading bread. Thea sat on a wooden stool near the hearth, watching the kitchen staff work. Slowly, carefully, she began asking questions about their work, their families, their lives. She listened when a young scullery maid spoke about her sick mother. She helped chop vegetables when the preparations fell behind. She laughed at the cook's stories and remembered everyone's names. By evening, word had spread through the servants' quarters. The new Omega Queen had a kind heart. She saw people, really saw them, in ways the highborn never had. And in the kitchens, at least, Thea Brystein had found her first true allies. Over the following weeks, Eirik watched something remarkable unfold. The shy Omega who had trembled before his throne was finding her voice, and it rang clearer with each passing day. It started small. Thea began spending her mornings in the servants' quarters, talking with Omega families about their children. She learned that most Omega pups never learned to read, were never taught they had value beyond service. So she established a school in the castle's east wing, filling it with books and slates, hiring teachers who believed that every wolf deserved education regardless of rank. The highborns scoffed. Anna spread rumors that Thea was trying to upset the natural order. But when Eirik walked past the school one afternoon and heard children's laughter echoing through stone halls that had been silent for years, he felt something shift in his chest. Thea didn't stop there. She created councils where wolves of all designations could bring concerns directly to the throne, not through layers of highborn intermediaries but face to face. Omegas spoke of unfair working conditions. Betas raised concerns about trade routes. Even some lower-ranked alphas found their voices heard for the first time. The kingdom began to divide. Traditionalists muttered about chaos and disorder, about an Omega Queen destroying everything their ancestors had built. But others, particularly those who had lived in the margins, began to hope. The breaking point came on a cold morning in the third week. An elderly Omega woman named Signa had dared to speak up at the market, suggesting a fair distribution of winter stores. A highborn alpha named Torsten had beaten her bloody in the street for her presumption, claiming it was his right to discipline an insubordinate Omega. Word reached Thea while she was in the library. She found Eirik in the throne room, surrounded by his council, and walked straight to the center of the hall. Her hands were shaking, but her voice cut through the assembled wolves like a blade. "An Omega woman was beaten today for speaking," she said, looking directly at Eirik. "Beaten for suggesting we care for our people through the winter. I want justice." The council erupted. "It's tradition," one alpha argued. "Omegas must know their place." "Then tradition is wrong," Thea said, her voice stronger now. She turned to face the council, her platinum hair catching the light. "If this kingdom's strength is built on cruelty to those who can't fight back, then we're not strong at all. We're cowards." Silence fell like a hammer. Eirik rose from his throne, his presence filling the hall. He looked at Thea, his mate, his queen, standing brave and trembling before wolves who could tear her apart. Pride blazed through him, fierce and hot. "Torsten will be stripped of his rank and exiled," Eirik declared. "And I'm establishing new laws. No wolf may harm another for speaking truth. Omegas are under the crown's protection, same as any other. Anyone who disagrees can challenge me directly." No one spoke. No one dared. That night, alone in their chambers, Eirik pulled Thea close. "You're teaching me," he said quietly, "that true strength includes mercy. That power without compassion is just tyranny." He pressed his forehead to hers. You're not just remaking the kingdom, Thea. You're remaking me. Jonas Viken arrived with the first winter storm, ice in his wake and darkness in his eyes. He was a mountain of a man, scarred from decades of battle, his gray-streaked hair pulled back in warrior's braids. The northern pack followed him into the great hall like an army, their boots thundering against stone, their presence filling the space with threat and challenge. Eirik sat on his throne with Thea beside him, and he felt her tense the moment Jonas entered. The northern alpha's gaze swept the hall with open contempt, lingering on Thea with an expression that made Eirik's wolf snarl beneath his skin. Alpha King. Jonas's voice boomed across the assembled court, silencing every conversation. I've traveled far to speak truth to power, even when that truth is unwelcome. Then speak, Eirik said, his tone flat and dangerous. Jonas stepped forward, his battle-scarred face hard as granite. You've taken an Omega as your mate. An Omega as your queen. He said the words like curses. This isn't just unconventional. It's an insult to natural law, to everything our ancestors built. An Alpha King must mate with strength, not weakness. Must choose a partner who can rule beside him, not a servant who can barely stand in his presence without trembling. The court erupted in whispers. Thea's face went pale, but she didn't look away. Jonas's voice grew louder, addressing the crowd now as much as Eirik. An Omega Queen makes you vulnerable. It shows you value personal desire over the kingdom's good. It shows weakness where we need strength. He turned back to Eirik, his gray eyes cold. I challenge your fitness to rule. The hall fell deadly silent. Even the fire seemed to still. I invoke the ancient right of trial by combat, Jonas declared. Face me in single combat, Alpha King, with your bond as the wager. If you lose, you publicly reject this arrangement and choose a mate worthy of your station. If you win, his smile was sharp as broken glass, well, you won't win. The court exploded. Traditionalists roared their approval, seeing Jonas as a champion of the old ways. Others gasped in horror. Challenging the Alpha King was dangerous enough, but wagering his mate bond crossed into sacred territory. Anna and Rebecca watched from the shadows, their faces alight with barely concealed triumph. Eirik stood slowly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. His power radiated from him in waves, making lesser wolves cower. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely lethal. You come into my hall. You insult my mate. And you challenge me. He descended from the platform with predatory grace. I accept your challenge, Jonas Viken. 3 days from now in the ancient arena. Trial by combat. His eyes flashed gold, the wolf rising to the surface. But know this. When I defeat you, and I will defeat you, you'll spend the rest of your life remembering that an Alpha King's strength is not diminished by love. It's magnified by it. Jonas bared his teeth in something that wasn't quite a smile. 3 days then. May the strongest wolf win. As Jonas and his pack withdrew, Eirik felt Thea's hand slip into his, small and trembling but refusing to let go. The 3 days before the combat stretched like years, each hour weighted with dread and determination. Eirik trained with brutal intensity, his body becoming a weapon honed by rage and fear. He worked practice dummies until they split, sparred with his best warriors until they couldn't stand, ran the mountain paths until his lungs burned and his muscles screamed. But the physical training couldn't silence the demons that haunted him in the quiet moments. What if Jonas was right? What if loving Thea had made him soft, vulnerable, weak? What if he failed her? What if he lost and had to watch her be taken from him, the bond severed, everything they'd built destroyed? Each night, exhausted and bloodied, he went to Thea's chambers. She never asked about his doubts, never pushed him to speak. She simply held him, her small hands steady on his scarred shoulders, pouring strength through their bond, faith and love and absolute certainty that he would prevail. On the night before the combat, Eirik sat before her fire, his head in his hands. What if I'm not enough? He whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep and wounded. What if loving you costs me everything? Thea knelt before him, tilting his face up with gentle fingers until their eyes met. Listen to me, she said, her voice fierce despite its softness. You're not fighting for the old ways or the new ways. You're not fighting to prove Jonas wrong or to defend tradition. You're fighting for us. For this. She placed his hand over her heart, where the bond thrummed golden and strong. And we are worth fighting for. We are worth everything. Something settled in Eirik then, a certainty that pushed through the doubt like dawn through darkness. The morning of the trial came cold and bright. Thousands gathered at the ancient stone arena, their breaths steaming in the frozen air. Thea sat in a place of honor, wrapped in furs, her platinum hair unbound and streaming down her back like a banner of moonlight. Before the combat began, Jonas stood at the arena's center, his voice carrying to every corner. "Behold your Omega Queen," he called out, gesturing toward Thea with theatrical contempt. Too weak to stand beside a king. Too fragile to rule. A pretty ornament who will shatter the moment real pressure comes. The crowd murmured, some agreeing, others uncertain. Anna and Rebecca watched with hungry eyes. Thea stood. Her legs trembled, but she descended the steps into the arena floor, walking until she stood before Jonas and the assembled thousands. When she spoke, her voice shook at first, then grew stronger with each word. "You measure strength by how hard you strike," she said, her clear voice ringing across the stone. "I measure it by how many times you rise after being struck down. By how you choose kindness when cruelty would be easier. By how you love when the world tells you you're not worthy of it." She turned, addressing the crowd now. "And by that measure I am the strongest person in this arena. Because I've been beaten down my entire life and I'm still standing. Because I choose mercy over vengeance. Because I love despite being told I don't deserve it." Silence fell, absolute and profound. Even some of Jonas's supporters looked uncertain. Eirik watched his mate, brave and trembling and magnificent, and pride blazed through him like wildfire. Whatever happened next, she had already won. The combat began at dawn's first light, and it was brutal from the first moment. Jonas and Eirik circled each other like winter wolves, their movements predatory and precise, violence barely leashed. The crowd pressed forward, thousands of wolves roaring for blood, their primitive hunger filling the frozen air. Jonas struck first, a vicious blow that caught Eirik across the ribs with bone-cracking force. Eirik twisted, using the momentum to drive his elbow into Jonas's jaw. The sound echoed across the arena like a tree splitting. Blood sprayed across frozen stone. They broke apart, circled again. Both were bleeding now, both breathing hard. The Northern Alpha was formidable. Older, more experienced, fighting with the brutal efficiency of countless battles. But Eirik was younger, faster, fueled by something more powerful than tradition or pride. The fight became savage. Fists struck flesh with sickening thuds. Bones cracked. They crashed into the arena walls, leaving dents in ancient stone. Jonas landed a strike that opened a gash above Eirik's eye, blood streaming down his face. Eirik responded with a combination that drove Jonas to his knees, only for the Northern Alpha to surge back up, roaring defiance. Thea watched from her seat, her hands gripping the stone so hard her knuckles went white. She felt every blow through the bond, sharp stabs of pain, waves of exhaustion, the burning determination that kept Eirik moving. She refused to look away, refused to let fear master her. Instead, she poured everything she had through their connection. Faith, love, absolute certainty that he would prevail. The fight raged on, minutes bleeding into what felt like hours. Both warriors were bloodied, exhausted, pushed beyond normal limits. They seemed evenly matched, two apex predators locked in combat that could only end when one fell. Then Jonas overextended. It happened in a heartbeat, a vicious strike meant to shatter Eirik's jaw, thrown with everything Jonas had left. But the force made him lean too far, left his side vulnerable for just an instant. Eirik saw it. Moved with speed that seemed impossible for someone so battered. He was inside Jonas's guard before the Northern Alpha could recover, his clawed hand closing around Jonas's throat, driving him backward and down. They hit the frozen ground with impact that shook the arena. Eirik's other hand shifted, claws extending, pressing against Jonas's jugular with just enough pressure to draw blood. "Yield," Eirik commanded, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent arena, rough with exhaustion but absolutely unwavering. Jonas struggled, pride warring with survival instinct. For a long moment the outcome hung in balance. Then slowly, reluctantly, Jonas bared his throat in the ancient gesture of submission. "I yield," he said, the words bitter as ash on his tongue. The arena exploded. Thousands of wolves howled their approval, the sound shaking the very stones. Eirik stood, swaying slightly, blood streaming from a dozen wounds but victorious. His eyes swept the crowd until they found Thea. She was already running, heedless of protocol or dignity, her furs streaming behind her. Eirik caught her, his arms closing around her despite his injuries, holding her like she was the only thing keeping him standing. Perhaps she was. "I knew," she whispered against his chest, feeling his heart thunder beneath her cheek. "I never doubted." The formal bonding ceremony took place 7 nights later, when the moon hung full and silver above the sacred grove where Eirik's ancestors had performed the same ritual for 1,000 years. Ancient trees ringed the clearing, their branches heavy with snow, their roots deep enough to remember the first wolves who walked these lands. Every pack in the kingdom came to witness. Thousands gathered in concentric circles around the sacred stones, their breath misting in the cold air, their eyes reflecting moonlight. A massive bonfire burned at the center, sending sparks spiraling upward to meet the stars. Thea and Eirik walked into the clearing together, hand in hand. She wore a gown of white silk that seemed to glow in the firelight, embroidered with silver thread in patterns that echoed the stars above. Eirik wore the formal leathers of his ancestors, dark and adorned with symbols of leadership earned through blood and sacrifice. The pack shaman waited by the fire, an ancient woman named Astrid whose white eyes saw far beyond the physical world. Her weathered face broke into a smile as they approached, genuine joy creasing features that had witnessed generations rise and fall. "Alpha King," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "You bring your chosen mate before the pack, before the moon, before the ancient powers. But this is not just a bonding. This is prophecy fulfilled." A murmur rippled through the assembled wolves. Eirik's hand tightened on Thea's. Astrid raised her arms, addressing the crowd. Centuries ago, it was foretold that when an Omega and Alpha King truly bonded, when love transcended rank and tradition, it would signal a new era. The end of rule by fear. The beginning of rule by unity. Her white eyes seemed to focus on Thea despite their blindness. "She is not an anomaly. She is the chosen one. And this bond will transform everything." Stunned silence fell over the grove. Then slowly wolves began to kneel. First 1, then 10, then hundreds, acknowledging not just their king but the destiny unfolding before them. The shaman produced a ceremonial blade, ancient and etched with runes older than memory. She made a small cut on Eirik's palm, then on Thea's, and pressed their hands together, blood to blood, life to life. The moment their blood mixed, the bond between them erupted in brilliant gold light, visible to every witness, undeniable and sacred. The thread that connected their souls blazed like captured sunlight, weaving around them, binding them in ways that transcended flesh and bone. The crowd erupted in howls that shook the ancient trees, wolves of every rank celebrating the union of their king and queen. Astrid placed a crown of silver and moonstone on Thea's head, marking her officially as queen. When Thea turned to face her people, she no longer looked down in Omega submission. She stood tall beside Eirik, her platinum hair catching moonlight, her gray eyes clear and certain. She had been invisible. Now she was luminous. She had been small. Now she stood beside the most powerful wolf in the realm as his equal, his mate, his queen. The prophecy was fulfilled. The kingdom was transformed. And love had conquered tradition. Spring came to the kingdom with wildflowers and new beginnings. Thea discovered she was pregnant on a morning when frost still clung to the windows, though warmth had returned to the land. When she told Eirik, he simply stared at her for a long moment before sweeping her into his arms with a laugh she'd never heard from him, pure, unguarded joy. Their daughter arrived with the autumn leaves, fierce from her first breath. They named her Astrid after the shaman who had bound them, and she was everything her parents were. Strong like her father, kind like her mother, and absolutely fearless. She inherited Eirik's dark hair and Thea's storm-gray eyes, and from the moment she could walk she was climbing things she shouldn't, challenging anyone who would engage her, burning bright as a wildfire. Over the years, 3 more children followed. Bjorn came next, thoughtful and strategic, always watching, always analyzing, carrying the weight of being the heir on his young shoulders. Then Freya, who inherited Thea's gentleness but possessed a quiet determination that surprised everyone. And finally Leif, joyful and adventurous, who seemed to find trouble even when trouble was hiding. Parenthood transformed them both in ways they never expected. Eirik, who had ruled through strength and control for so long, learned to be playful. Thea would find him wrestling with their children in the gardens, his deep laughter echoing off stone walls as Astrid tackled him and Leif tried to bite his ankles. He told them stories before bed, his warrior's voice softening for tales of ancient bonds and legendary wolves. He showed them that true strength included tenderness, that power was meaningless without love to guide it. Thea, once so timid and uncertain, discovered a fiercer side of herself when her children needed protection. When a visiting alpha insulted Freya for her gentle nature, Thea's response was swift and cutting, her quiet voice carrying more authority than any shout. She became the shield her children needed, finding reserves of courage she never knew existed. But parenthood wasn't without challenges. Astrid inherited strong alpha traits and her temper burned hot. More than once, Thea found Eirik holding their daughter while she cried frustrated tears, teaching her that strength didn't mean lashing out, that true power came from choosing when to fight. Bjorn struggled under the pressure of expectation, believing he had to be perfect to be worthy of the throne. It was Thea who sat with him during his darkest moments, teaching him that failure was part of growth, that their love wasn't conditional on achievement. Freya faced bullying from children who mistook her kindness for weakness. Eirik taught her to fight, but Thea taught her something more important, that gentleness was its own kind of strength, that the world needed soft hearts as much as it needed warriors. Leif's wild energy tested their patience daily, but it was his joy that reminded them why they'd fought so hard for change, so children could be free to be exactly who they were. Through it all, the bond between Eirik and Thea deepened, strengthened by shared purpose and the family they'd built together. Years passed like seasons, each one bringing change and growth. The children grew into remarkable adults who embodied both their parents' strengths. Astrid became a fierce warrior who fought for the vulnerable, Bjorn a wise advisor who listened before he spoke, Freya a healer whose gentle touch mended more than bodies, and Leif an explorer who brought joy and discovery back to the kingdom. The reforms Thea and Eirik had implemented took root deeply. Omegas now had legal protections written into law, access to education, opportunities to rise based on merit rather than birth. The rigid hierarchy that had defined wolf society for generations softened into something more fluid and just. Children of all designations played together in the castle gardens. The schools Thea had founded flourished across the realm. Then one autumn day Anna and Rebecca returned. They arrived separately, months apart, both broken by years in loveless political marriages arranged for status and power. Anna bore bruises on her arms that spoke of violence. Rebecca's eyes held a hollowness that came from being treated as property rather than person. They came seeking forgiveness, expecting rejection. Instead, Thea opened her arms. She gave them refuge in the castle, helped them escape their abusive situations, supported them as they slowly remembered how to be whole. Anna eventually bonded with a kind beta merchant who made her laugh, who valued her sharp mind over her bloodline. Rebecca found joy teaching at one of Thea's Omega schools, discovering that helping others heal helped her heal herself. "How can you forgive us?" Anna asked one evening, her voice breaking. "After everything we did to you?" "Because holding on to bitterness would only poison me," Thea said simply. "And because you deserved better than what our mother taught us." "We all did." On Thea and Irik's 10th anniversary, they returned to the balcony where they'd first kissed, where the bond had fully awakened between them. The same stars wheeled overhead, ancient and eternal. Below in the gardens, their children played, Astrid teaching Leaf combat moves while Bjorn refereed and Freya tended to scraped knees with patient care. "Do you remember?" Eirik asked, his arm around Thea's waist. "When I told you that you'd unmade me?" "I remember," Thea said, leaning into his warmth. "I was wrong." His voice was rough with emotion. "You didn't unmake me. You remade me into something better, something whole. You didn't just give me love, Thea. You gave me a reason to be more than a weapon. You showed me that strength and compassion aren't opposites, they're partners." Thea turned in his arms, her gray eyes meeting his dark ones. Silver threaded through her platinum hair now, and lines crinkled at the corners of his eyes, but the bond between them burned as bright as ever. "And you taught me I was always worthy," she whispered. "I just needed to believe it. You saw me when I was invisible. You valued me when I thought I was worthless. You loved me until I learned to love myself." As stars emerged overhead, their bond glowed soft gold in the gathering darkness. A light that had never dimmed, a connection that had only deepened with time. They held each other close, two souls who had defied tradition, fought for their love, and transformed a kingdom through the simple but revolutionary act of choosing each other, again and again every single day. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful story of destiny and transformation. Let us know what you thought of this tale of courage, love, and the power to change a kingdom. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. Did Thea and Eirik's journey inspire you? Which moment moved you most? The first meeting in the Great Hall, the arena battle, or the prophecy fulfilled? And if you enjoyed watching an Omega rise from invisible to unforgettable, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time, and remember, true strength is found not in dominance, but in the courage to love despite what the world tells you is possible.